Thank you. What we propose to do is start with each of the three panelists spending about 10 minutes, starting with Pankaj and then moving to Junaid. And then, so, this is not on? It's on. Okay. We're going to start. I'll do it louder then. Classroom style. We're going to start with Pankaj Mishra, then move to Mohammed Junaid, and end with Arundhati as panelists speaking, each for about 10 minutes or reading from certain things that they wish to talk about. I should say that my wife and I spent a week in Kashmir this past summer talking for 3 of those days, talking intensively to students, high school students and teachers about Azadi, which is the translation, I think, that is of the word freedom in the title of this book. And in that 3 days of intensive discussion, the main thing was not it was not a case for Azadi or a case against Azadi. It really revolved around what really was meant by Azadi. I think it's an unsettled thing in certain ways, even at least for some in Kashmir. And so hopefully at the end of the session we'll have a better idea of what that might mean. Anyhow, we'll spend 10 minutes. Each of them will spend 10 minutes. We'll then spend a few minutes in conversation with each other, questions asked of each other, and then hopefully around 40 minutes of Q&A from the audience and from the web. And we'll end with Arundhati will be doing a reading of 5 minutes at the end as a closing. So without further ado, Pankaj, do you want to begin, please?
Thank you, Philip. Thank you. I first went to Kashmir in 2000, which was, I'd been there before, but to write about it. The first time was in 2000, which wasn't, Junaid may correct me, which wasn't the worst year, that there were no major massacres or, for instance, unarmed protesters.
Can you speak louder, please?
Something's happened to my mic.
Just speak loud.
Oh. Sorry, it's just slipped off. Is it better?
Yes.
Okay, great. So it wasn't the worst year by any means, but it was still shocking for someone like myself. At a very obvious level, the atrocities, the tragedies, the number of people killed. The current figure is 70,000 people killed in the last 20 years, not to mention innumerable many mutilated, orphaned, widowed, tortured. So they were all there. Almost everyone I met had a story of atrocity to tell. And I was shocked by my own ignorance because, like many other Indians, I had freely expressed my opinions on Kashmir before, without ever bothering to verify them by direct experience. And I was shocked by how little I had been informed by the Indian media about the situation there, which was essentially one of military occupation. Really I think probably the most militarized zone in the world, where you could see a soldier practically after every 50 meters, wherever you went in Kashmir, in the valley. And I came back really completely, and in many ways it was the beginning of my own political education. And I've been writing about this for almost a decade now. I think I've written tens of thousands of words on this subject. And yet I find, and there have been other people writing about it, but I find on the whole, Kashmir seems it's been sort of doomed to this very long solitude, very long silence when you compare it to other peoples elsewhere who've been cruelly besieged in their own homelands by very powerful nation states. Tibet comes to mind. The Palestinians come to mind. There are whole libraries of books devoted to these conflicts, very, very intricate, very minute analyses. But nothing comparable to that exists for Kashmir. There's a recent book, A Curfew Night, which many of you would have read, where the author, the Kashmiri author, Basharat-Pir, talks about going through bookstores in Delhi and finding all these other books on various parts of the world, like Tibet or Palestine. Very, very well-written books, very eloquent books. And he says everywhere he went, in these bookstores, he found what he called only the unwritten books of the Kashmir experience. His book was one of the first. There have been others since then. And I think what is happening now is that the Kashmiri silence is being broken by Kashmiris themselves. And we have with us one of those voices tonight. And I think more and more Kashmiris are beginning to write, beginning to tell stories about their experience, often turning those stories, that experience, into art. And there's a novel I want to read from. It's not actually been published here in this country. It's called The Collaborator. It's on the Guardian's shortlist for the best first book. And it describes a Kashmiri teenager growing up essentially in a small village on the border between the Indian and Pakistani bits of Kashmir. The novel is narrated by this teenager, and he describes how he's employed by a captain in the Indian army to go down into a valley near the village and collect the ID cards and weapons of the corpses that are there. Thousands of corpses which are just there on the valley floor strewn about. The corpses are of Kashmiri militants or freedom fighters, whatever you decide to call them, who crossed this border, this line of control, into Pakistan for training. They were gunned down by the Indian army, often just captured and executed. And the ID cards the captain needs for just public relations, when take pictures of the ID cards next to the corpses, and also when they release press, when the Indian army issues press releases about the militants it's killed. So in this excerpt I'm going to read, the Kashmiri narrator describes going into this valley where the corpses are. And this is a landscape of his childhood. When I go down the first time after all these months, years, it is with a sense of both pressing nostalgia and fear. The valley looks like a large green sheet hung tenderly from the surrounding foothills, with a singing, humming is more like it, rivulet in the middle. It's still the same, a calm, largely uninhabited, solitary place nestled amidst the rings of our hills and mountains. In my childhood, it was very easy to ignore the Pakistani and Indian checkposts on either side. You forgot about them the moment you stepped on new, untouched, fresh from dried dew grass and ran downhill for a few minutes before making generous boot marks. I liked long eights and floral designs all over the place. They were far off, distant, almost unreal, and by the time we took off our clothes to splash about in the low and languid stream, we had assumed full ownership of the place and didn't care who was or wasn't peering at us from some ugly checkpost out there on the mountainside. After swimming in the chilly water, we would lie down on the thick carpet of grass for ages, looking at the really, really blue sky and conjuring up odd names for clouds that hung low over our valley before drifting to another one across the mountains. I spent a long time down there, perhaps all my childhood. I don't have a lot of other memories from those early days. Ma and Baba probably thought it best to let me spend all my time there, not venture out, stay safe inside the valley, so that I wouldn't clamor to move to the city when I grew up and be lost forever. In the years of my growing up, many border boys went to Sopore or Srinagar or other towns to study, and many refused to come back. Some of them ended up as bus conductors or worked as waiters in rickety restaurants on the national highway. Their parents' cattle herds dwindled with each passing year and brought poverty, loneliness, and ill health. I suppose my parents were scared too. In the years after I grew up, some of the boys either became guides and scouted city boys across the border into training camps in Pakistan, or became militants themselves to relieve their parents of their yoke of shepherds' its lives and give them proper homes when Kashmir would gain its independence. Many disappeared like that from time to time. I guess those who went to the city were luckier. My friends, all my friends went away too, and God only knows if they will ever come back. Not many do, you see. And those who don't live very long here, because the army people, the protectors of the land, have decided that there is only one way of dealing with the boys: catch and kill, catch and kill. I therefore ended up staying with my parents and their cattle. I stayed on in the valley and in the end came to own it all by myself. I look at the first few corpses and am immediately horrified at the prospects of what my first ever job entails. There are probably 6 of them ahead of me. Ugly grins, unbelievable, almost inhuman postures, and a grotesque intermingling of broken limbs make me dig my teeth deep and hard into my clenched fists. What an elaborate litter. There are bare wounds, holes dark and visceral, and limbless, armless, even headless torsos. A low moan struggles, screeches inside. Gradually I approach one of the more intact bodies, gingerly, eyes reduced to hairline slits, and look for a pocket or bag amidst all the dirt and the crushed blood on his clothes. I find the ID card in his back pocket, and in some kind of limp, involuntary motion, throw it into the nylon army rucksack the captain gave me last week. It's not easy collecting identity cards and whatever else you can find on dead bodies. Bodies after bodies, some huddled together, others forlorn and lonesome, in various stages of decay. Wretched human remains lie on the green grass like cracked toys. Teeth, shoes, for God knows how long, I just cannot remove my eyes from this landscape. Heaps of them, big and small, body parts, belongings littered amidst the rubble of legs and arms. Macabre, horrid ghouls on either side of the brook watch me from their melancholic black hole eye sockets. I guess whoever ended up in the stream was fortunate to be washed away. Carcasses with indefinable expressions on what remains of their faces. I hope I don't recognize anyone. This is what we get, they seem to ask. The smell, the smell, the smell. I cannot begin to describe what it is like the first time. You just stop breathing. That is it. The stench is so powerful that your guts begin to pull your throat down, sort of strangle you from within, if you know what I mean. On the first day, having touched my first ever corpse, I bathed twice in the evening with scalding hot water and a copious amount of soap, scrubbing and scratching myself into rashes and red nail slashes all over my chest and arms. I can't eat well, owing to the nausea that comes over me for the next few days. It's not easy picking stuff off dead people. I'll stop here.
Thank you. Vinay?
Thank you. I was 8 years old, and it was 1989, and it was a year of clarity. We were all really clear about what was going to happen and what was going on. We had understood the nature of rule we were under in that year. Our homes were full of political discussions. Our parents were discussing this strategy and that strategy. We all knew that India was militarily very powerful. We hadn't seen it yet completely. We had only seen CRPF and police that year. But they were like some idolists, boys from the neighborhoods, really charismatic, wise boys, generous, kind people, some of whom just crossed over, which we used to call a poor. We used to imagine Kashmir as a house with a partition, the line of control, and Pakistani-controlled Kashmir was another room of the house. India was never foreign, outside. So we had a deep sense of history, a history of 400 years of occupation, of foreign rule, and we hadn't given up during those 400 years. Our ancestors hadn't given up. And so 1989 began with this year of idealism, with this year of resolve that we will finally throw India out. And then we saw trucks and lorries of Indian soldiers coming into our towns, coming into cities and villages, occupying every little space, defamiliarizing all the places we had known. And they crushed the spirit. 8 years till 1998, when I lived there, it was a terrible, terrible experience during those 8 years. The number of people who died, the kind and generous people who died, who didn't deserve to die, the mothers who lost their sons, the houses that were burned down, and neighborhoods that were burned down together. 1998, I left Kashmir, and I used to come back in summers and winters for a little bit, but I fully returned in 2008 when I thought that things were getting normal. I could just go and teach there for a while and see what we can do. So I began teaching at this small university in Kashmir, and we used to call these conditions, this situation, halat. And as soon as I returned, halat also returned, and everybody thought that, in my family at least, that I had brought back the halat. In 2008, the controversy about a land deal took place, and it was followed by immense sea of people like breaking the shackles, like in 1989, when we were untying the knots of fear. In 2008, we also untied lots of those knots. But it was again followed by severe military repression. The spaces were occupied again, and streets were out of bounds. 3-month-long curfews took place, and which reminded us of the year 1990 when Jagmohan, the governor of Kashmir, imposed a curfew for 2.5 months, literally starving thousands of families in Kashmir because there was no access to food, there was no access to medicine, there was no access to anything. And it was in the dead of the winter. This time it was summer, but people continued to, strike back in form of demonstrations, in terms of pelting stones and whatnot. And then in the November of 2008, government suddenly decided that they wanted to hold an election. I wrote a small piece during that time, and I wanted to connect democracy with occupation. And I'm going to read it out. I must point to the absurdity of elections under occupation in Kashmir. After the summer 2008 protests and the 5-month-long harsh clampdowns, people were surprised that the government wanted to hold elections. These previous months had exacted a heavy toll, not only in terms of lives lost and people injured, but also the suffering of those whose livelihoods depended on uninterrupted daily activities. The hawkers, the shopkeepers, daily wage earners, laborers, etc. To many, the announcement of elections sounded like a cruel joke. But by late November and December, the months in which the elections were to be held, an unusually large number of people decided to contest. There was even a distinct buzz of election campaigning in the air. I was in Anantnag on the day of election and took some notes on the day's events. It's 9 a.m. Overnight drizzle has darkened the winter bare trees. The hill around the town is wrapped, around which the town is wrapped, has disappeared in the mist. I look out onto the road in the distance to see if anyone is moving. There was an explosion a couple of hours ago. It must have been somewhere close. A few police jeeps can be seen moving fast every few minutes. I'm curious to see if people are going out to vote. My parents advise me to stay indoors. We have been without electricity since last evening. I use this fact as a pretext and announce that I'm going to go out to get it fixed. I see large boot prints in our mud-spattered kucha. Soldiers must have been moving about in the night. It is the election day in Anantnag, and the bandobast is tight. A few meters ahead, after a bend in the kucha, 2 people from the colony, father and son, are looking dejectedly at the electric transformer that supplies our neighborhood. The father turns to me and says, "Every soldier in this cinema has a heater, and a boiler of his own. They get 2 phases, and the rest of us get 1. It can't take this load. He is talking about the cinema hall in our neighborhood, which was taken over by military almost 18 years ago and turned into a camp. It houses more than 300 soldiers. Our colony has around 30 houses. The electricity transformer was installed way back in the 80s for these 30 houses and the cinema. Each night of the winter, the fuse blows. An elderly man has come out of his house with pieces of aluminum wire in his hand. To hell with them, and if that wasn't, why would they be here? He blurts out in Kashmiri. We laugh. A military chopper comes out of nowhere and flies low overhead. Our laughter is drowned in the sound. Both the laughter and the chopper disappear quickly. We can see the main road from where we are standing. Soldiers manning the road stop a car. They make gestures for the driver to come out. He is apparently showing some papers. One soldier flings his door open. As soon as the driver steps out, another soldier lands his heavy, muddy boot on the driver's belly. Oh no, they have just destroyed his perfectly clean Ferran. How will he wash it now in this cold winter with no electricity? Quips the man standing next to me, and then giggles in his own dark sense of humor. One of his own relatives was beaten to pulp 2 months back. Soldiers had dug a hole in his arm with a screwdriver. The driver receives a rain of blows and soon passes out. Soldiers drag him to the side. The man standing next to me bets the driver is pretending to be unconscious. He is right. One soldier kicks him hard in the belly and the driver is up. He limps back to his car and drives away. 2 trucks packed tightly with sullen and frozen Kashmiri men down the main road. A young man who has joined us says wryly, "They are bringing people from outside to vote. They don't need our vote." A cab is moving toward us slowly. We are alert and ready to dart back into our homes. It's a Kashmiri driver, therefore safe. He stops near us. A thin vein of blood is issuing from the corner of his mouth. These hers, Kashmiri expletive, pulled me out of my home in the night and asked me to ferry troops to Kadipora. They gave me a paper telling me no one would ask me questions on my way back. But at every checkpoint, they stop me and hit me, even after I show them this darned paper. Hathas, they have no sympathy, no humanity, the elderman says, trying to console him. Then I returned home to write. For the last 2 months, elections have been taking place. Kashmir's assembly elections are happening in 6 phases. Anantnag is the 5th one. Srinagar will be the last. Today, like in all other phases, the rest of Kashmir is under curfew. It reminds me of Dr. Aziz in Salman Rushdie's Midnight's Children, examining the body parts of his future wife through a perforated sheet, one by one. Beyond the regular election day restrictions, people have been barred from going out on Fridays as well. No prayers have been offered in the largest mosque in Srinagar, Jama Masjid, for the last 6 Fridays. People are not allowed to assemble. The main preacher at Jama Masjid and head of Hurriyat Conference, Mirwais Umar, is under house arrest. Thousands of pro-freedom activists have been bundled into jails. Against many of them, draconian black laws have been slapped, which means they will be put into prison for the next 2 years without trial. Yasin Malik, who has already been in jail at various times for a decade, is one of them. In Anantnag last month, 100 parents were picked up randomly by police and the paramilitary and were told to warn their sons not to get involved in the pro-independence campaign. Many young men have already been beaten up and warned to stay indoors. A friend who works for the local newspaper was threatened and his young brother tortured for reporting on police atrocities. He was told to do favorable stories about the election. He's following orders to the word, he tells me. He doesn't want to give up his job, for they don't come easy. Pro-government Ikhwani militias, which are funded and armed by the Indian state and who wreaked havoc on Srinagar for a full decade, have been reactivated. Many of the militiamen who were integrated into the army wander about the town in civis and harass people. A lot of people, it seems, want to vote. If not in Anantnag town, then in the villages. They need their representatives to relieve them of the tremendous pressure the Indian state puts on them. During the past few months, thousands were arrested. They had no one to go to for redress. Governor's rule meant one inaccessible Indian bureaucrat controlled everyone's life in Kashmir. A legislative assembly would mean at least that they can go to people who might have some say. That's what the contestants are promising. People in jails shall be released. The level of military oppression will be brought down. Government militias will be reined in. Major parties are saying this vote is not a vote for India. And thrown in between are a number of others who have one or the other motivation to contest, and none of them is loyalty toward India. In Delhi, however, political analysts are claiming victory over Kashmiri separatists. Indian newspapers and TV channels are gloating over the turnouts, 68%, 57%, etc. The numbers encouraged even India's Prime Minister Manmohan Singh to come to a village in Anantnag a few days back to support his party's candidate from there. The village he visited is surrounded by hills full of bombs. Indian military has one of its largest ammunition depots in the region. Last year, the hills in Kundru exploded into a huge ball of fire and gulped dozens of Kashmiri lives. The military asked villagers in 15 villages surrounding the depot to vacate so that the depot could be expanded. No word was spoken about that. To the Kashmiris Manmohan Singh was addressing, he said India would defeat terrorism soon. He was talking about Mumbai. Across the stream that runs behind my home, young men from the neighborhood who were leading stone-pelting duels and protests against Indian soldiers over the summer and the autumn are playing cricket. The stream almost dries up in winter, leaving a little plain island behind. Soldiers can't see it. It's almost 3 in the afternoon, and I haven't seen anyone go to vote yet. But there are 2 more hours to go, and who knows? Thank you.
It's difficult to speak about Kashmir now, especially if you live in India, because the charge of sedition is always lurking. But I just want to say a few things very clearly. One is that while India brutalizes Kashmir, in so many ways, that occupation brutalizes Indians. It turns us into people who are able to bear a kind of morally reprehensible behavior which is done in our name. And the fact that so few Indians will stand up and say anything about it is such a sad thing. It's such a sad thing. Just to put things slightly in perspective, when the United States attacked Iraq, it deployed 165,000 soldiers. There are 700,000 soldiers in Kashmir. As Junaid said, between 68,000 and 70,000 people have been killed in the conflict. Just last month, finally, the State Human Rights Commission has ordered an inquiry into mass graves, unmarked graves of thousands of people that have begun to surface. Just, I think, 7,000 in 2 districts. There are many more unmarked graves which now either they are trying to destroy or disappear. There are 10,000 disappeared people. There are many, many widows and orphans. And the army, of course, does Kashmiris the favor of running orphanages for orphans whose parents they have killed. I think that it's worth studying the brilliance of the Indian occupation of Kashmir, because it is nothing short of brilliant that what is going on in Kashmir should have been going on for all these years, and so few people know about it. And the nature of the occupation is not simply brutal. It's not just that, people are given numbers and there are checkposts and there's torture. About 100,000 people have been tortured, Kashmir has its Abu Ghribs across the valley. The most horrible one, for some reason, is fondly called Papa 2. Of course, I should say that there is torture and encounters and fake encounters, a very Indian term for summary execution by police or armed forces all across India. But the scale at which it's been happening in Kashmir in the past, I think, it's remarkable that the world has not paid attention to it. But in 1989, when actually the first major armed insurrection began, I think what happened was that thousands of young Kashmiri men crossed the border and were given arms by Pakistan. And it wasn't as though there was a very disciplined movement that then trained guerrillas to be political people who came across the border. It was like almost anybody who wanted a gun could get one. So there was an orgy of violence which was then violently crushed. But today, what you're seeing, even as the world speaks about the Arab Spring, 3 years in a row, there was massive, unarmed uprisings on the streets of Kashmir. And it isn't as though the army or the security forces were looking away. They were shooting into the crowd. They were killing young children. Stone pelters were being taken in, sodomized in prisons, having their fingernails pulled out. And if you look at, for example, what does it mean? What does it mean to live in an occupation where you have soldiers like you go out of this auditorium and you have to pass 15 checkposts before you go home. You have to watch your families and friends and parents and children being humiliated, or you have to watch somebody come to your home and pick up somebody and then they disappear in some army camp or some prison, and then the women have to go from prison to prison, from camp to camp, begging for news of someone who's been picked up. You can imagine the vulnerability of women who have to do that. They're not going to even complain about what happened to them because they have to do that to get some news of their loved ones. But beyond that brutality that you can understand, there are so many other devious ways in which people are controlled. For example, in 1989-90, when the uprisings first happened, the Indian government really had no way of knowing who are the leaders, who are the people, what is really the chatter going on. So it really set up, funded a number of newspapers, Urdu newspapers, English newspapers, some of them overtly critical of the Indian government, some of them wildly exaggerating figures of what was going on. But these were just ways of creating listening posts, of somehow making leaders surface, of somehow being able to understand really what is going on, are either threatened or bribed or paid not to tell the truth of what is going on. The army knows exactly what's going on in every household. People have to get army permission to have weddings. They have to have their guest lists approved. It's a pretty unbelievable situation. And yet, even today, even in this event, it was going to be what Kashmiris call a flyover project, in which either Indians or Pakistanis will discuss Kashmiris. Actually, Junaid had not been invited. I had to say, listen, I will not speak unless there's a Kashmiri person who's going to represent themselves. Because I am not speaking on behalf of Kashmiris. I speak as a person who lives in India, who finds what is going on there absolutely morally reprehensible. And every time any debate in India begins, it has to begin with the declaration that Kashmir is an integral part of India. In fact, what does that mean? Actually, we barely know what India means. You know, India is not some natural condition. You know, it's not like a sort of cyclone or a natural phenomenon. In fact, the borders of India as a nation state were first marked out by the British. And Kashmir was never a part of India. It has historically been ruled by the Mughals, by the Afghans, and by the Dogras. Anyway, we can't get into the history of that. But the point is that, my point is that last year at some stage, a journalist stuck a mic in my face and said, "Madam, is Kashmir an integral part of India?" And I said, "No, it isn't." And for that, I continue to be threatened with being charged with sedition. But even President Obama, who when he was campaigning, did say that to solve the conflict in Kashmir was important in order to solve the conflict in that whole area. But by the time he visited India last year, he kept very quiet because he was trying to sell some aircraft and some Boeings, and you don't mess with your client's sensibilities when you're trying to sell something. So he kept very quiet about Kashmir, though he spoke about terrorism and human rights in every other place. It's such a vast subject. It's hard to just say something in 15 minutes. But there are other ways in which this occupation works. I remember talking to a friend who was telling me how the army, Junaid talked to you about elections. How do you really say that you have free and fair elections, even if you have a 90% turnout, when a place is occupied by hundreds of thousands of soldiers all day, all month, all week, all year long for 20 years? It's not a question of just pushing people on the end of a bayonet to the voting booth. There are so many subtle ways of controlling the population. And one of those ways I thought was amazing. A person was picked up in a village and taken to jail, where obviously he was being tortured and so on. And then a local politician went on a hunger strike, demanding the release of this person. Won a lot of support from people. But actually, it's a pact between the army and the politicians, right? We'll pick up a person, you go on a hunger strike, we'll release them, and then you will get the votes. So how? And every time there's an election in Kashmir, people are told that it's an election for local amenities. It's a municipal election, really. It's not about Azadi, because if you live in a military occupation, and if you don't have any representatives to go and plead your case somewhere, if someone has been picked up, someone has been killed, then you really are in a very, very serious situation. So the minute people go and vote, then they're told, oh, this is a vote for India. Kashmiris want to be a part of India. Normalcy has returned. So I think we should open it up for questions. But I have traveled to Kashmir. I have very, very dear friends in Kashmir. I want to say quite unambiguously that I do not think that any country that calls itself a democracy has the right to force people to remain with it, in a militaristic way, in the way that India is doing. In order to prove that it's a secular country, it is brutalizing Kashmir. And this does not prove secularism in any way. So I'm pretty clear that I do believe that the people of Kashmir have the right to self-determination. They have the right to choose who they want to be and how they want to be. I don't believe that there can be any debate, any clarity, any honesty in that as long as that military occupation continues. So initially, obviously, the first step would be to demilitarize, to withdraw this absolutely unbelievable law called the Armed Forces Special Powers Act, which allows even non-commissioned soldiers to kill on suspicion, that gives the army complete impunity. Now, of course, the Indian government wants to deploy the Indian government, ever since India became a sovereign nation, has been at war with what it calls its own people. Since 1947, it has deployed the army in Manipur, in Mizoram, in Nagaland, in Kashmir, in Punjab, in West Bengal, in Telangana, in Goa, and now it plans to deploy the army against the poorest people in the country, which is in central India. And for that, the army is asking for the Armed Forces Special Powers Act to be more or less promulgated all across the country. It may have a different name, but the provisions will be the same. So I think what I'd just like to say that in order to sort out the absolute horror that is unfolding in Afghanistan, the civil war that is breaking up Pakistan, Kashmir is a key issue. And none of this area will be, the conflict cannot be resolved unless Kashmir is resolved. And I can't see why the international community doesn't see that when you have two nuclear-armed states like Pakistan and India, there couldn't be a better thing than to have a buffer state like Kashmir between them, instead of it being a conflict that is going to spark a nuclear war. It could be a zone that would ensure peace in the region. Thank you.
Our panelists will now speak among themselves for a couple of minutes, and we'll gather the cards. So could you please, if you have a question, pass the cards, if you haven't already, to the aisle. Thank you very much.
Well, maybe I'll ask a question as you were talking. Supposing by some magic wand the military were to decide to leave. And in fact, of course, the current chief minister has asked that the Armed Forces Special Powers Act be withdrawn from certain parts, particularly in Srinagar and so on, gradually or slowly. What would, and the military, the pressure were off, as a thought experiment, what would Azadi then be? And would it be for the whole of Kashmir? Would it be just for the valley? Would it be for a broader area? What would it look? What would a freed Kashmir look like? Pankaj, you want to start, or just you want to?
You start, Junaid, then I'll.
Junaid?
Well, having lived under a military occupation for so long, the first thing Kashmiris would do is not to have an army, as a free nation. The second thing, which is how would Kashmir look like? What are the borders going to be like? I mean, the principle is given in the right to self-determination. The United Nations has passed dozens of resolutions on it, and the right is given to the entire people of Jammu, Kashmir, Ladakh, Gilgit-Baltistan, and Azad Kashmir. And all of the people of these regions have a right to decide if they want to be part of India, Pakistan, or be independent. And in my opinion, most Kashmiris unambiguously want political independence, and that extends beyond Kashmir Valley, but primarily in Kashmir Valley. And so that's one part of the question. And the question about how Kashmir would be is that, look, we are living between three nuclear powered countries, nuclear armed countries, India, Pakistan, and China. We can't but live on the fact that these countries have to have mutually good relations, for us to exist as an independent country. And what we also hope for is that a free Kashmir will be a space where India, Pakistan, and China could mutually resolve these issues and give up or start giving up their own militaristic, ambitions, start denuclearizing the entire region, But I think what Arundhati rightly pointed out, Kashmir is the key. It's the absolute knot around which this entire region is tied and will remain tied as long as it remains as it is.
No, I mean, I agree. I think Kashmir has been seen far too long as a problem. We need to start looking at as the solution in that region, which offers the key, really begins to unlock a whole series of very complicated problems there. I think if you look at the way the Pakistani army has consolidated itself over the past decades, has become such a menacing institution, it's because Kashmir has been so much part of the whole Pakistani nationalist narrative, and no politician really can dare distance himself or their parties from it. So I think it's really good for all of us if we sort of focus on this particular issue and resolve it. And I think this is really the beginning of a larger peace in the region. And somehow, I don't know. I mean, as Arundhati said, I mean, Barack Obama came to power in 2008 with exactly these kinds of sentiments, with very explicit statements about how Kashmir is the key and that this is the central problem, we need to look at it, we need to resolve it, and gone silent since then.
I think I just want to say a couple of things. One is that obviously when there is a colonizing state, and we in India know this very well, that during the Indian freedom struggle, the British were always pointing out to imperfections in Indian society, and there were many, and saying the natives are not ready for freedom, the natives really are not developed enough to look out for themselves, and all of that. Lots of that is happening between India and Kashmir. But one of the key things which a lot of people keep asking me is, the questioning of the idea of a nation state. And do you really support creating yet another nation state? And my answer to that always is that I do think there are a lot of serious problems with the idea of a nation state. But I think it's ridiculous to ask somebody at the periphery to start asking those profound questions. Let's in the heart of the U.S. or in the heart of India start questioning the nation state before you ask a militarily occupied people to ask these profound questions. One. And the second is that this constant sort of demonizing of the Kashmiri struggle as, oh, it's jihadis, they are Wahhabis, they are Islamists, they want to create another, Islamic Republic. First of all, we know that countries like the US don't really have a problem with Wahhabis because Saudi Arabia is a good example of that. We know that the Nazis were most comfortable with the Zionists, and they were the only group of Jewish people they would talk to. Similarly, right now you have the Indian government very, very comfortable with Wahhabi groups in Kashmir, allowing them to be funded, allowing them to grow, because the Wahhabis, in fact, in Kashmir are not pro-freedom because they don't believe in nationalism. So they are talking about a much larger project. So it's really quite complicated, the creation of religious fundamentalisms. And it isn't as though, I'm not saying that there are not, that there isn't an Islamic sentiment in Kashmir. Of course there is, but even the secular Hindu in India has a certain sort of Hindu texture to their life, so there is that in Kashmir. But to suggest that it's a jihadi uprising, I think is completely out of line, and the Indian government is very, very comfortable with jihadis or Wahhabis.
Any other issues that you think ought to be raised that we haven't raised here?
I really want to say one thing about this conception of India, I mean, whenever I think about, I used to travel by bus from Delhi to Srinagar many times, and on the roadsides you would see these signs that Kashmir is the crown of India. Kashmir is the head of India. And I often wondered, what is this? Why is Kashmir the head? Is it because the map is upside, north is up? And then I realized that, no, the conception of India in the popular imagination, not maybe among the secularizing elite in India, is of India as Mother India, as a Bharat Mata, whose head we are supposed to be. An odd kind of a head, as simply a place where we have had a tradition of Islam and Hinduism and Buddhism for thousands of years, a unique tradition of our own, and have nothing had to do with India except for certain cultural contexts. But we have had much more to do with Central Asia. We are essentially part of Central Asia, not South Asia. India and Pakistan to Kashmir are outside, We are much more connected to Xinjiang or Tajikistan or Turkmenistan and Afghanistan and even Iran through cultural influences. So really, we have to start questioning this idea of India as this naturalized entity. What does it represent in the popular opinion? And we have to also ask this question. Many people in India do that if Kashmir were to go on its own, the Muslims in India are not safe. That says a lot about secularism in India. If the Muslims, 140 million of them, their security and safety is dependent on what Kashmiris decide, then it says a lot about really their security and their future in India. So we need to really think about these questions.
I think there's just one thing and an important thing that we haven't spoken about in all this.
Yeah.
And that is perhaps the most contentious issue of the Kashmiri Pandits in Kashmir. And there was a population of Kashmiri Pandits. There still is a small population of about 5,000 Kashmiri Pandits, but about 300,000 Kashmiri Hindus actually. There was an exodus from the valley in 1989 at the time of the uprising. And the reasons for that exodus are seriously contentious. But, it's very interesting that many of them live in miserable conditions in the camps in Jammu. Others have moved to Delhi and are doing very well for themselves, but are very vociferous and fire their guns off the shoulders of those who live in the camps. And you can imagine that the government of India, with 700,000 soldiers in Kashmir, has not been able to tell the Kashmiri Pandits in the camps, why don't you come back? Because it's also part of why don't they offer the Kashmiri Pandits protection, so many armed soldiers? Because the Indian government also uses those refugee camps to once again paint it as a jihadi struggle. And right now, what is interesting in the dynamic of the return of the Kashmiri Pandits to Kashmir or the secession of Kashmir from India, in a way, both are struggling with the same problem, and that is the problem of being a religious and ethnic minority in increasingly chauvinistic societies. So if the Kashmiri Pandits were to be in Kashmir, in an independent Kashmir, they fear being targeted as a minority. And the Kashmiris within India are targeted as a minority much more than even the rest of the 150 million Muslims who have now been pushed right to the bottom of the social ladder, where it's difficult for them. They live right at the bottom, along with the Dalits, which are the lowest caste in Hindu society. They have been ghettoized in many places, like Gujarat, and targeted in so many ways. So it is really a battle of the imagination of minoritism, and why would anybody want to actually submit to that if they can help it?
You want to say something about pundits?
Oh, no, I just wanted to add.
As a pundit yourself, you must.
I just wanted to add to this. I mean, the whole idea of the nation state in a place like India or even China, where the certain minorities that become extremely vulnerable in this new nation state. And we are essentially creating the nation state on the ruins of older empires, a place like the Qing Empire. I mean, the whole Tibet problem really emerges from this curious post-colonial consolidation of the collapse of these empires, and you find no place for these minorities. You have this very heavily centralized nation state, and then you have these minorities. Now, previously, the relations with the state, with the center, were very different, were very differently mediated altogether. So, there were looser ideas of sovereignty around. There were just different way of, rethinking those relations. But now, with these very heavily centralized nation states, and increasingly, as you say, chauvinistic nation states, especially in the last decade or so, which they're so heavily invested in their international image. They're sort of this imminent international superpowerdom that a lot of Indian nationalists aspire to, and that has made this issue so much more complicated.
I'm not interrupting because, in fact, half of these questions were about the pundits. Some more were things that we've already been talking about. But let me push the pundit issue a little bit more in this Azad Kashmir that we are thinking about. The hidden agenda, quite apart from the Wahhabis, you wrote in your 2008 piece about the Pakistani flags, the Islamic cast to what was going on in Kashmir. Certainly in the 89 to 91 period, that became increasingly evident. And again, resurfaced in 2008. It seems to have come down a lot now. But it raises the question, is Kashmir an Azad Kashmir to be an Islamic state in any sense of the term, do you think? And if so, what would be the fate of the Pandits? What would be, or would it be a secular state? I should add, by the way, that these high school students that I talked to insisted it would be a secular place. What do you think?
Oh, I want to say a couple of things on this. Actually, 3 things. One is that in Kashmir, Wahhabism is really not a problem. In a way, they are one of the oppressed lot. Because a majority of people are very pluralist, have been influenced by Sufism, follow different sort of lines of Islam, and have Islamic sensibilities, which means that they're not really asking for any Islamic state, which is in itself an oxymoron. There cannot be an Islamic state, and many people are kind of discussing this. There can be Islamic parties within a state, but there cannot be an Islamic state in itself. What would it look like, really? Which state in this world is an Islamic state? It could be a state where Muslims form a majority, and they say that, okay, we are the first-rate citizens, and rest are second-rate citizens. But that's not going to happen in Kashmir. So the second thing is that South Asians really do not understand Hindu-Muslim relations in Kashmir. They begin to see the relations from their own history of communalism. They see 1947, they see Gujarat, they see all these other anti-minority violences in India and in Pakistan. But we have a very different sort of history with Hindus. Kashmiri Pandits were the Pandits, they were the Brahmins. We were the undercaste who converted en masse to Islam. So there was one sort of relationship, it was a caste relationship in a way. The second was a relationship of class. The Hindu minority was during the Dogra rule before 1947. It was embedded within the state structures, which continued even after 1947. Kashmiri Muslims were largely peasantry, landless peasants. And from 1931 onwards, when these political mobilizations began in Kashmir, these were really subaltern struggles for better education, better rights, equal citizenship. They didn't demand that they are the first citizens. They demanded equal citizenship. And it is fairly well documented in the New Kashmir document, which came out in 1944, one of the very profound, very advanced progressive documents to have come out. It included even right to leisure. And the thing is, and it wanted an independent state of Kashmir and citizenship of all, irrespective of caste, creed, or any other form of identity. It included rights for women and everything. Even it was only like, when did women in France and England start really getting voting rights? In the early part of 20th century. But the point here is that in Kashmir, the history in 1947, when South Asia was burning, Kashmir was the only place where there was no communal violence, when it could have happened. Although the Maharaja, who was a Hindu, who colluded with a lot of right-wing Hindu groups in Jammu, and led to a massacre of more than 100,000 Muslims in Jammu, and drove out 500,000 Muslim residents of that region. It did not provoke any reaction in Kashmir Valley. Kashmir was very peaceful. There was no violence between Hindus and Muslims. In 1990, I was there. It happened in 89 when the movement started. A lot of Kashmiri Pandits, unfortunately, were like, India, as you said, it's a brilliant occupation. It works by, dividing communities. It had employed a number of the Hindu Kashmiris into the state structure. So they became the first targets of the militants. Like some of them who were assassinated. And 20th January 1990, when the mass migration of Pandits happened, by that time, 270 people were killed in Kashmir, out of which 201 were Muslims and 69 were Kashmiri Pandits. Over the last 20 years, 219 Kashmiri Pandits have died compared to So we cannot talk in terms of this equation of Kashmir as a Hindu-Muslim issue. We understand Kashmiri Pandits. Kashmiri Pandits understand Kashmiri Muslims. Kashmiri Muslims say that they're rushit, which means that they're momentarily, annoyed. Not annoyed. It's not even translatable. It's a Kashmiri way of saying that somebody, when they're not talking to you for a while. You know? It's sort of a relationship between a husband and wife or lovers. And Indians do not understand it. They think that, there's some sort of a genocidal mentality going on in Kashmir, which is not true.
I think now when we use this word secular, and if we are going to say that what's going on in India is secular, then we're in a lot of trouble, because in secular India you have a chief minister of Gujarat who's presiding over the massacre of Muslims in a metropolitan city quite openly, the rape of Muslim women, the burning alive of people, and the due process of democracy goes on, but nothing ever happens to anybody. And that is considered secular. He's called a great development chief minister, and now the Americans are getting increasingly happy with him because he's giving subsidies to Ford, and why don't you come and make some cars here, and we give you some loans, and come and dump your toxic waste here. We'd love that. Why don't you come and dismantle your ships here? So you can kill a few Muslims and then do that, and you're secular. So I think we'd have to find some other word for what we think we mean when we say secular.
Yeah, and also find another word to acknowledge the traditions of religious coexistence and pluralism in a place like Kashmir. This is, pre-nation state. This is always underplayed in relation to the secularism of the nation state, which has a kind of prestige and authority. These experiences you're describing of centuries of coexistence simply do not have. And this is highly unfair. This is the way our whole discourse is structured about these concepts like secularism or the Islamic State, is that you always credit the secularism of the nation state with a kind of moral superiority it simply does not possess.
You have to question the idea of secularism in itself, also in terms of the number of crimes that have been committed in its name. The entire history of modernity has left traces of genocide, trails of genocide behind it. In India, Narendra Modi calls Congress a pseudo-secular party. He calls himself secular. BJP calls itself secular. We have to really think that what is being done in its name. In South Asia, or in Central Asia, we have a different sort of conception of mutual coexistence. Secularism has a Western genealogy. It came out of a specific history, church-state relations. In India or in Pakistan or in Kashmir and elsewhere in South Asia and Central Asia, we have to think in terms of these pluralist traditions, where the state itself loses its meaning as the sole, legitimate user of violence and stuff, things like that. We have to, when we begin to question these, notions of state and secularism and things like that, then we'll see our region in a very different light.
Okay. Again, there's a huge number of questions here. Many of them are for Arundhati about other things, and others are about stuff. Those of you who are going to get a book signed might quickly ask her those questions, I think. There is one here about which I will translate it in a sense, about why, the question about why are we so ignorant about Kashmir? What is it, both from within India, why does the Indian media, why does the American media, why does the world media not pay more attention to Kashmir? What is it? What is it about, in that sense, that we're afraid of, perhaps?
Well, let me try and answer that in a slightly roundabout way, if I may.
You have 3 minutes before your closing statement.
In the late 80s and the early 90s, when sort of American capitalism won its battle against Soviet communism in the bleak mountains of Afghanistan. As we know, a whole kind of radical Islam was created in order to fight the Soviets, and that also sort of percolated down into Pakistan, into Kashmir. And India sort of realigned itself from being one of the leaders of the non-aligned movement. It aligned itself completely and began to call itself a natural ally of Israel and the US. And it opened up its markets. And I often say it opened two locks. One was the lock of the Indian market, and the other was the lock of the Babri Masjid, which is this old mosque, which was a disputed site between Hindus and Muslims, because the Hindus believed that it was the birthplace of the Lord Ram, and of course the Muslims believed that Babur had built it. And when they opened that lock, it unleashed two kinds of totalitarianism into the area. One was economic totalitarianism, a kind of economic fascism, and the other was right-wing Hindutva. And both these manufactured two kinds of terrorists. One, the economic process has manufactured what the Indian government today calls the Maoist terrorist, and the other was the Islamist terrorist. And both allowed whichever government was in power, either the BJP, the Hindu right, or the Congress, to militarize, to become more and more a police state, using either this terrorist or that terrorist as an excuse. But the fact that the Indian markets had opened and we were open for business now, and today India is one of the great sort of favorite finance destinations, meant that, for example, the absolute horror of the genocide of Muslims in Gujarat went more or less. I mean, imagine if Saddam Hussein had done it, there would have been a lot of noise. But here, because it was open for business, because the Prime Minister of India, Manmohan Singh, who was then at one point he was the finance minister, who did open up the markets. Now he's the Prime Minister of the greatest democracy in the world, but he's never won an election in his life. But he was the IMF man, and genuflecting before these neoliberal policies means that you buy a lot of silence, you buy a lot of goodwill. So nobody who's coming to India to sell their aircraft or imagine a market of so many million people. The people who want to sell us things are going to be happy to remain quiet about a lot of things. And one of those things is Kashmir, that you do not mention the word Kashmir because they will be down on you like a ton of bricks. Your contracts will be cancelled. So you're not allowed to talk about Kashmir. And even we're not allowed to talk about Kashmir. But recently, in the last 3 years, these uprisings, which nobody cared to call the Kashmir Spring, had a lot of young Kashmiris writing on Facebook, and somehow the word got out, and the absolute consensus in India has cracked. And that is why the government is very, very nervous. I'm not saying a majority of Indians know what's going on, but a lot of people do now, and a lot of people are extremely, extremely uncomfortable about somehow participating in this occupation.
We've run out of time, but you have your closing.
I'll just read the last few paragraphs of an essay I wrote a couple of years ago. In liberation struggles, few things are more important than dreams. A lazy utopia and a flawed sense of justice will have consequences that do not bear thinking about. This is not the time for intellectual sloth or a reluctance to assess a situation clearly and honestly. it could be argued that the prevarication of Maharaja Hari Singh in 1947 has been Kashmir's great modern tragedy, one that eventually led to unthinkable bloodshed and the prolonged bondage of people who were very nearly free. There's absolutely no reason to believe that history will repeat itself, not unless it's made to, not unless people actively work to create such a cataclysm. This is because, they keep saying that, the partition will be repeated, the killings will happen again if anything happens on Kashmir. However, none of these fears of what the future holds can justify the continued military occupation of a nation and a people, no more than the old colonial argument about how the natives were not ready for freedom justified the colonial project. Of course, there are many ways for the Indian state to continue to hold on to Kashmir. It could do what it does best, wait, and hope that people's energy will dissipate in the absence of a concrete plan. It could try to fracture the fragile coalition that is emerging. It could extinguish the nonviolent uprisings and re-invite armed militancy. It could increase the number of troops from 500,000 to 1 million. A few strategic massacres, a couple of targeted assassinations, some disappearances, and a massive round of arrests should do the trick for a few more years. The unimaginable amount of public money that is needed to keep the military occupation of Kashmir going is money that ought by right to be spent on schools and hospitals and food for an impoverished, malnourished population in India. What kind of government can possibly believe that it has the right to spend that money on more weapons, more concertina wire, and more prisons in Kashmir? The Indian military occupation of Kashmir makes monsters of us all. It allows Hindu chauvinists to target and victimize Muslims in India by holding them hostage to the freedom struggle being waged by Muslims in Kashmir. It's all being stirred into a poisonous brew and administered intravenously straight into our bloodstream. At the heart of it all is a moral question. Does any government have the right to take away people's liberty with military force? India needs azadi from Kashmir just as much, if not more, that Kashmir needs azadi from India. Thank you.
I just want to announce that the book is for sale, and those of you who've already purchased it and would like to have it signed by our authors, please exit the auditorium, and they will be waiting for you on the A level, just outside the doors. If you would like to buy the book, please get it in the lobby, and if you'd like to have it signed, you can come back downstairs to the lower level. Thanks very much for coming tonight. Good night.